Bienvenidas, maestras y maestros. Welcome all. Before I get started, I just want to make a little note that I'm going to open up with an introduction of myself and how I developed the patent behind FabuLingua. Those of you who've already seen the first webinar, the one on comprehensible input, affective filter, silent period, you will have already heard this information, so please feel free to fast forward through this intro slides and meet me at the agenda page if you're not watching it live. So let's get things kicked off. Learning languages opens up doors in life. FabuLingua's mission is to give every child that unique advantage of learning a new language effectively. And you teachers are on the front line of making this possible. So the purpose of today's webinar is to equip you with a way more powerful approach than you may have already had at trying to make this happen. In the previous webinar, I gave you an overview of the main developments of modern language learning science that can take you from someone who is teaching a language to someone who is helping their students acquire that language naturally and subconsciously. Now, in this webinar, I'm going to share with you how using stories in your classroom will be your magic sauce to making that happen. My name is Leslie Omaña-Baggert. I'm the co-founder and head of learning at FabuLingua. My family is from Venezuela, and I grew up in Spain and the UK. And this early bilingual opportunity led to a lifetime of opportunity for me. I speak English, Spanish, French, and Mandarin Chinese, and I've lived and worked all over the world. But my founder journey started when I took my little Texan son from Austin to Caracas to meet my abuelita for her 100th birthday. Unfortunately, my son and my family did not connect like I'd hoped. They couldn't communicate. Like many Latino families in the US, we spoke English at home. So when I came home brokenhearted that this critical door to his roots was shut, I looked for resources to help him teach him Spanish. But I was super frustrated at the ineffectiveness of existing products. I'd studied child psychology, linguistics, and anthropology at Oxford and Cambridge. So super frustrated, I created a new methodology for teaching languages through children's stories. And it led to natural, subconscious language acquisition. It was a real breakthrough, so much so that I got a patent for this learning technology. Unlike most traditional methods, this method was based on the science of second language acquisition. Both my kids were engaged and developed Spanish skills that far exceeded their peers, both in preschool and then elementary school and eventually high school, even though we did not speak Spanish at home. The science is really clear about what works. As we discussed in the previous webinar, the key to acquiring a second language is comprehensible input. Now, if this term sounds odd to you, if you've never heard it, if you've heard it a few times but don't really know what it is, I suggest that you go back to the previous webinar and listen to that one before continuing with this one. In this webinar, we're going to discuss how to bring the most effective kind of comprehensible input into your classrooms. And surprise, surprise, the most effective way is through the good old-fashioned story. We're going to look into the effectiveness of storytelling in teaching and look at various methods that you can use in class to deliver CI through stories. And finally, we're going to end up with how FabuLingua can be of great help in this. On the agenda today, storytelling and its benefits, how you can use different forms of storytelling in your classroom to deliver CI, and how you can leverage technology like FabuLingua to do so more easily and in less time. Hang on a second. So, excuse me, let's dig in. It is human nature to love hearing and telling stories. So it's no surprise that the research shows that stories are at the heart of very effective learning. But did you know that you can also use stories as a super powerful way of teaching a second language? Storytelling is the art of narration. It has a universal tradition that is ancient, dating as far back as prehistoric cave drawings. In one way or another, we've been telling stories since the dawn of man. Stories are the most traditional form of communication. They have been used to entertain, to inspire, to influence, and to educate. Think back to Plato, who summarized his arguments with vivid myths, analogies, parables, metaphors, and allegories that took hold of people's imaginations in a much more powerful way than did his arguments. It's no surprise that storytelling is a powerful tool for teaching. So, why is its full potential seldom recognized? Well, ever since the industrial age and the birth of the concept of a classroom, teaching has been driven by the need to build a competent future workforce of students. And as the classroom has become professionalized, serious teaching techniques have dominated, from lecturing, drilling, worksheets, dictation, and rote memorization of facts. And stories have commonly been reserved for reading practice. In effect, stories have been perceived as lightweight, soft, not real learning tools. And albeit educators occasionally relate stories to lessons, it's mainly to connect, entertain, share experiences, rather than to educate on its own. In our modern society, stories have not been considered an integral part of teaching or learning until recently. As we have transitioned from traditional rote learning to more alternative and/or contemporary educational methods like Montessori, Waldorf, project-based learning, and flipped learning, the power of storytelling as an educational tool has been increasingly reevaluated. Reading stories can reap benefits far beyond what the eye can see, especially for children. It develops phonological awareness, increases memory and concentration span, stimulates imagination and curiosity and wonder. It builds empathy and social emotional learning. It opens doors to new cultures and tradition. And of course, it builds listening and literacy skills. As Einstein points to in this quote, these are all critical components that go into raising an intelligent human being. In fact, research has found that our brains are actually hardwired to remember information that comes in a story format. Psychologists have referred to stories as psychologically privileged, meaning that our minds treat stories differently to other types of material. People find stories interesting, easy to understand, and easy to remember. In fact, psychologist Jerome Bruner actually put a number on the power of a story. He found that facts are 20 times more likely to be remembered if they're told as part of a story. Communicating information in a way that's interesting and engaging will always be more effective for both comprehension and retention than just simply hearing the plain facts. But is all storytelling created equally? Well, remember Stephen Krashen, the linguist that we spoke about, and linguist and researcher that we spoke about in the first webinar? Well, his research has found that when it comes to acquiring a second language, it turns out that reading stories is the most effective approach. His research showed that teaching vocabulary lists is a big waste of time. But reading that same vocabulary in the context of a story is the most powerful way to learn that vocabulary. In fact, it is 10 times more powerful to learn vocabulary through reading than through memorizing vocabulary lists. Now, this should really come as no surprise to English teachers teaching native English speakers. We all know from personal experience that the students with the best vocabulary are those who are big readers, not those who memorize lists for standardized tests. Well, it turns out that the same is true for second language learners as for native language learners. Reading improves vocabulary instruction way more than memorizing does. And it's not just Krashen who's observed this. It's been documented by many other researchers, finding that the incidental learning of words during reading may be the easiest and single most powerful means of providing large-scale vocabulary growth. But okay, maybe one might argue that that's only true for vocabulary and not true for more complex grammatical structures. Perhaps those have to be explicitly taught. Well, it turns out that the research also tells us that even the most notoriously hard grammatical constructs to teach, like, say, the subjunctive in Spanish, are best taught through reading rather than through formal study aimed at, say it, said subjunctive. In fact, the amount of free voluntary reading is a better predictor of competence in the subjunctive than even how long subjects have lived in a Spanish-speaking country. So now let's turn to children's stories. So finding the right balance between under and overstimulation can be a challenge. In fact, researcher Dr. John Hutton presented to the pediatric academic societies and found that there is a Goldilocks effect when it comes to a young child's ability to process a story. If you look at the top left, he found that listening to stories on audio, such as language learning podcasts, can be enjoyable, but the lack of visuals often causes the young learner to lose interest quickly. These stories seem to require more cognitive strain to process the story, and he deemed those as too cold. Cartoons on the other side of the spectrum, down here on the bottom right, are lively and colorful, but often overstimulating to the child's brain. He said that the fast-moving media renders imagination and integration less necessary, so they're just too hot. And this explains why oftentimes plunking your toddler down in front of the TV doesn't seem to lead to much learning, and how, in contrast, reading illustrated children's stories often really feels just right to both parents and teachers. It explains also why the children's illustrated story persists as such a uniquely powerful teaching tool for young kids. But how do illustrated stories perform when they're digitized to be lightly animated and interactive? A study from Eric Thiessen at Carnegie Mellon University actually demonstrated that there might be a link between these interactive, lightly animated books and the amount of story that the child remembers. In fact, his research showed that children could remember 15 to 20% more information when they read from books with digital animations and interactions, especially in interactions that were related to the plot and action. So the theory he put behind this is that the amount of information absorbed by the child's mind is proportional to the level of engagement in the learning process. But are there other deeper reasons why storytelling is so powerful? Well, yes, have a look at this slide. Look at all of the brain systems and the hormones that are activated when we hear a story that are not activated when we hear facts. There is neural coupling, mirroring, and the activation of many additional areas of the brain, such as the motor, sensory, and frontal cortex. There's increased dopamine, cortisol, and oxytocin. Why all this flurry of activity across the brain for a story? Well, when we experience stories, we immediately relate the emotions and events in the stories as our own experiences in our own life. And neuroscientist Norman Farb explains that brain imaging has shown that it activates the same parts of the brain as if we experience the events and emotions in real life. That's why, for example, when we read about a sad event, we can literally feel sad. And why, when we read thriller novels, our hands literally start sweating. And why small people on a screen across the room can cause us to have an outburst of belly laughter. Stories quite literally move us. Farb explains that the way stories are processed in our brain means that stories aren't just about the protagonist in the story. On a neural level, they're being processed as if they're about us. And biologically, we are the most important and the most interesting thing to our brains. When we hear a story, our brain is hard at work trying to make sense of the story as if it were about us and how we interact with what the brain already knows about the world. This highly engaging evolutionary aspect is a very, very important activity in the brain. And this is what makes stories extraordinary teaching tools. The fact that on a neural level, we experience stories as being about us is precisely what makes stories extraordinary vehicles for building empathy and cultural awareness. So, typically, when we're learning a second language, we're not just wanting to learn a language in isolation, but we typically want it as a passport to have insights and a connection into another culture, into another perspective. And as we just discussed, stories are uniquely good at creating empathy for other individuals and societies. They're great vehicles for creating cultural awareness. So, take the movie Coco, which came out in 2017. You could try and explain Dia de los Muertos to a non-Latino child, but it will likely just be understood intellectually as something outside of their realm of their own life, and there'll be no personal connection. However, when a child watches a movie like Coco, they get caught up in the flow of the story and begin seeing it through the eyes of the protagonist, like Miguel, and understanding and empathizing with a new cultural perspective. So let me take a little break here. Now that we know all about the power of stories on the human brain, let's take a look at the practical applications of bringing stories into the classroom to deliver comprehensible input. The fact is that ever since Krashen's findings that CI is the key to second language acquisition, CI teachers have been experimenting for decades now with how to best deliver CI to their students. And it should not now come as a surprise that overwhelmingly they are choosing to use stories as their main delivery vehicle. CI teachers understand that for the affective filter to be low, engagement needs to be high, and that stories are some of the most engaging content that they can provide their students. And so CI teachers have developed many ways to lean into the power of stories to create compelling, comprehensible input for their students. And we're going to explore some favorite story-based approaches for delivering CI. A little note here, these next 4 examples come from Emily Meador. She's a longtime elementary school CI teacher in Austin, Texas, and we'll be publishing. And she wrote a blog for us that we'll be publishing soon, so you can go deeper into each approach in that blog. So we'll just mention them briefly. TPRS, teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling, is one very popular method. It was created by Blaine Ray in the 1980s. He was a high school Spanish teacher. And typically a teacher, in order to do this, would choose a well-known story that features high-frequency words that repeat throughout the story. Then she would pre-teach a lot of that vocabulary, the high-frequency vocabulary, through associated TPR movements. For those of you who don't know, TPR is total physical response, and it's kind of like a signing. It's not sign language, it's not ASL, but it's where students associate words with a particular action or sign, like mira would be this, etc. So she teaches the TPR movements for that vocabulary. And then before she tells a story, Emily gives 3 instructions for her class. The first is that when she says a new fact and spreads her arms wide, they go, ah, in unison, get the whole class working together. And then when she says, pero hay un problema, they all go, dun, 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 in unison. Again, kind of making it more interesting. And of course, if they don't understand something, they do this and she will translate. So then throughout the story, she brings students to the front of the classroom to be actors, and she gives them props to make it more comprehensible and exciting. And there is a little skit that develops, and she basically guides them through the skit by asking a story with a series of questions that guide it along. That is TPRS. Clip chats is another method of bringing storytelling in the classroom. And it's a very engaging way of presenting CI to your students. It used to be called movie talks, but now that everything is shorter in our media world, it's called clip chats. And in order to do a clip chat, the teacher must find an engaging clip of a video that her students will love, taking into account their age and their interests. And she needs to make sure to find videos that she can discuss that using high frequency words. And ideally, we'll be able to repeat these words several times when talking about the video. So after the start of the video, she presses pause, and every few seconds, she talks about what's happening and asks her student questions, either easier questions, either or, what color, yes or no, for the entire class. And she sometimes asks harder questions of individual students who might have the language to be able to answer that. Now, a little note here, it's not uncommon for teachers to spread a 5-minute clip into 3 or 4 classes while doing a clip chat, as they pause quite frequently to ask the student questions. And sometimes students get frustrated with this, but the reward is at the end of the series of classes, they'll be able to listen to the whole thing being narrated without pauses. The third very popular story-based method of bringing CI into the classroom is leveled readers. It's one of the most relaxing, low-prep ways to deliver lots of CI. These leveled CI readers are often in the form of chapter books, and they've been written specifically for language learners using comprehensible language that is simple, often uses a lot of cognates and a lot of repetition. So often teachers use level readers through the old-fashioned read aloud with students, and it's very calming and engaging in a typical classroom. Sometimes the teachers project the books on the big screen in front of the class, and that way the students are able to see the words as the teacher reads them. And here is a picture of Emily Meador with her very own CI reader that she wrote called Nico El Ñeque. It's a novice level reader for elementary students, and it features an adorable Panamanian rodent called a ñeque, who is buried and lost his meal, which is a seed from a spiky black palm tree that they have in Panama. So you guys should check that out. The last very favorite methodology is story listening. It's very popular on YouTube as well. You should check it out there. This was coined by Dr. Beniko Mason. She's an English teacher in Japan. Dr. Stephen Krashen talks about her work a lot and is very complimentary about this method. And basically, it describes a method she uses with her students where she establishes meaning by sketching on a whiteboard. So it requires the teacher to draw out a story as she is telling it. It's a very easy way of getting lots of CI into students' heads. And the basic idea is that you think of a story that's familiar to you, the teacher. Say, in this case, Emily's using Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and she draws out the story on a whiteboard while telling it in comprehensible language and using cognates where possible. So, she uses, instead of avena for porridge, she'll use sopa for soup. So she kind of might edit the story in order to make it more comprehensible with cognates. And Emily tells me that her students beg her for story listening, and she loves this. And she also really does want to reassure a lot of teachers, because she delayed using story listening because she was intimidated by the fact that there was so much drawing involved. But she actually said that not being artistically gifted is by no means a barrier to do story listening. In fact, kind of quite the opposite. The students love it when teachers don't do perfect drawings and look very human at the front of the classroom. So these have all been lots of ways. And again, you can look at our blog to go into more details and maybe see some videos of how Emily uses these 4 methods in her classroom. So now I come to using storytelling with technology, because technology, as humans, we always use it to make our lives easier and better, to be able to go further with a certain concept. At FabuLingua, we combine this proven power of storytelling that we've been talking about with technology to deliver the most effective language learning solution for kids and teachers. So instead of teachers spending hours of their personal time hunting around for lots of stories or movie clips that would lend themselves to CI teaching and then figuring out how to simplify them, am I going to make them into a Google slide? Will I just act them out? Am I going to draw it, point, blah, blah, blah? The teacher can use FabuLingua, and it gives them a whole bunch of lightly animated, interactive, goofy stories that are instantly comprehensible through FabuLingua's patented method. The best part is that it's all done for you lesson plans. So you can either set the stories up for each child to do individually with their earphones on as one of the stations that they rotate through in your class, or you can do it as a class-wide activity that is projected on the whiteboard, or class-wide activity where all the students have their own earphones on. Or a lot of teachers used flipped learning model where they set the stories as homework, and then the students come in and do one of our printable activities or one of our many fun class-wide projection-based games. How you use FabuLingua is totally up to you. And our stories go from beginner to intermediate levels, and they're all written and illustrated by Latin American and Spanish authors and illustrators. FabuLingua, it's a fabulous world of comprehensible input for kids to learn Spanish through children's stories. In fact, that's where our name comes from. Fabula is Latin for story, and lingua is Latin for language. At FabuLingua, kids learn languages through stories, comprehensible stories. But that's not all. All of these comprehensible stories are set in a fun mobile game, which has the effect of skyrocketing their engagement. As you'll remember from our previous webinar, this kind of positive emotion lowers students' affective filter and really boosts subconscious language acquisition. In the game, players are explorers on this magical island of FabuLingua, and their mission is to discover all of these secret, beautiful locations across the island. To unlock new locations, they'll need to read the interactive stories of the characters in their current location, earning gold and diamond keys that unlock treasure chests in the fabled shop. These are full of rewards like stickers and playing cards and magical compasses that unlock the next location. So basically, think of it as Pokemon meets Zelda for language learning. And when we say that we've made it easy for teachers, we're not just referring to the vast amounts of CI that you'll now have at your fingertips for your students. We've also created an easy-to-use teacher dashboard to pair with our award-winning mobile game. Here in the dashboard, you'll be able to add students, create classes, integrate with Clever, see exactly what progress has been made by which student on which mode in each mini game, in each story. So you'll be able to benefit, in addition to be able to have all that visualization, from our additional resource guide, where you'll be able to do a lot of extension games in class with your students on those same stories. And because we know that teachers spend way too much money of their own buying resources for their students, we've decided to make the platform available for free to teachers. That's right, available for free to teachers. Our goal, to create a whole generation of teachers who will be much more effective at teaching languages with a lot less prep time. As language teachers, you all know that learning a new language opens doors in life. So join us in our revolution to bring this life-changing power to children and teachers around the world. Muchas gracias. Thank you.